you very much. Thank you for your contribution. So I'm just thinking about some of the ways we can make these topics more practical and useful for the audience, and I've been taking some notes. And if we try to boil down some of this conversation, I mean, at the most basic level, what I'm thinking about over here is if you look at any of these new technologies and how they're affecting our ability to not only communicate, but even undermine our public discourse, how might we respond to that? Erica, can I start with you on that?
Well, I think there's a couple of key things. First, technology has been an amplifier in very positive ways, but what it's also causing, as Rahaf mentioned, is this siloed nature of what information we're receiving. And from that, if you look at Facebook or Google, the ability for 5 big companies based in Silicon Valley to manipulate the information and how we communicate. And so I think that both the danger and the response is to design better ways to ensure that we're having true productive discourse and not being manipulated by large companies.
Right. And Rahaf, you mentioned something really interesting about belief systems. And before we came up, we were having a sideline chat on dignity and what this all means to people in terms of how it develops. How would you add to that question in terms of what it means for our human conversation, our public discourse?
I mean, I think what's really funny is that the technology is new, so everyone's talking about the technology, but there is this hidden force that we are all influenced by, which is our belief system. And oftentimes we tend to discount that because people think they can compensate for it using policy or organizational culture. And I'll give you a very quick example, which is Netflix had put a policy in place 2 years ago that people could take as much paid time off as they wanted. No questions asked, as long as they were getting their work done. And then they were surprised when not many people ended up taking advantage of this policy. And when they asked them why, they said they weren't worried about what their manager would think. They were actually afraid about what their colleagues would think and about how their colleagues would translate or would interpret their going on vacation as them not being deserving of that next promotion or that next raise. And you said to me, that we were talking very briefly about universal basic income, and you said, well, that removes some of the doesn't that remove some of the dignity of work? And to add to what you said, we chose as a society to put together dignity and to put together work and to associate our identities of what we do so strongly with who we are. But that is something that we chose. And if we were to reframe that, I think having an economic system where people were guaranteed a certain level of prosperity, I actually think personally that is far more enabling people to have dignity than to reduce their contribution to society to a form of economic output. So I think, and we can deep dive into that later, but I think the idea is we really need to come back to the human element, because our cultural assumptions around work will trump technology, and it will trump leadership decisions, and it will trump policy every single time. So you can't unravel any of that without dealing with the core.
That's great, thank you. Julia, you sparked an interest when you used the word augmentation. So I guess one of the things that immediately I thought about was, if there is a perceived threat with new technologies coming on board that could change the way we work or even how we work in this regard, can you explain a little more how that augmentation piece would work? Can you clarify that more?
Yeah, although, can I just say one thing about the internet and how it has affected the discourse, and then if we want to get into that. But one thing I think is really interesting about social media, I mean, we all love to dwell on its being an echo chamber, which it is, and people find affirmation for the pre-existing biases there. But there is something that's really, salutary about that set of mechanisms, and that is that now there's a sort of expectation that as an individual who would in the past have just been a consumer of ideas, that now there's an expectation that you'll have a take on what somebody else is saying or what has happened in the news. And so, of course, we turn into idea producers. But there's just a much stronger expectation in public discourse that that people will, vote in this way in terms of just putting out their view. And so I think it's not surprising that the very first, wave of that would not be maybe the most mature, sophisticated form of that, and that there is a lot of just retweeting and liking and lack of originality. But I think what we're seeing over time is people developing the capacity to actually think for themselves and actually put a point of view out there. And I think it's actually a very good thing for the broader public discourse. Just on augmentation, the idea there is just fundamentally that there's been a mindset of automation with technologies, that the reason you bring them in is because they're labor saving. And labor saving, of course, means that you need less labor. You can get rid of some of this very problematic wetware in the organization, because after all, people are really problematic to have around. They're needy. They need, for instance, plumbing and lots of other things. They need perks. They're not completely trustworthy. You need to put lots of systems in place. They get tired. So it's, there are a lot of reasons that you might want to just simply bring in a machine to do the work that they were doing. But when we're talking about cognitive technologies, if that means that now you're no longer employing people to move to the next level of work, but you're somehow thinking that the decision making that your organization needs to do is simply going to be done by machines, then you have set yourself up to remove any chance of competitive advantage that you might have, because there's nothing more replicable for your competitors than your investment in technology. Technology travels extremely easily. So what you have to do more than ever is figure out how to get the competitive advantage out of the part of your business that is so hard to replicate and so hard to scale, and that's the human strengths that you continue to rely on. So you have got to use the technology to leverage human strengths, not because that's just good for humans and we're all human and this is, again, some act of altruism, but because that's the only chance you have of winning in competitive markets.
Can I say one more thing about augmentation? So when I think about augmentation, I go to the nanotechnology and bioengineering format. So if you think about the industrial age, humans produced fuel, food, and weapons. In today's age, humans can produce bodies, brains, and minds. And one of the greatest fears I have is we'll see this enhanced class of superhumans that are able to use these new breakthrough technologies, and it could really lead to an elite class. And I think of movies like Iron Man, but what that could really do to society and how it could radically shift and cause those that are poor not only to become further behind, but at a deeper level beyond natural evolution.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think it's a good segue, because Dawn, I wanted to ask you, so if you look at this whole social contract piece that you were describing, you mentioned, for example, in the US, certain jobs that men have or women have. What is the broader social impact that you really kind of take away from that?
Well, let me give you an example. This is not in the future, this is today. So when Alex and I were writing the book, we wondered, how far could this go? Could you have a company that was software, where you had no CEO, no management, no people? It'd be a bunch of smart contracts and autonomous agents on a blockchain. It could raise money in a crowdfunding campaign, which, by the way, have raised more money this year than all venture capital, $3 billion. It could be programmed to do its work. That'd be kind of cool, because you could program out things like moral hazard, you know, where managers do things that are not in the interests of their stakeholders. They give themselves big bonuses and so on. And we called it the Distributed Autonomous Organization. We almost didn't publish it because we thought, you know, fine line between vision and hallucination. And it sounds a little futuristic, but we did. A week after the book came out, an organization was launched called the Distributed Autonomous Organization. It had no CEO, no management, no people. It was a bunch of smart contracts and autonomous agents on the Ethereum blockchain. It was a venture capital company, and its goal, first step, was to raise money. In 3 weeks, this entity made of software raised 143 million US dollars. 143. An order of magnitude bigger than any other crowdfunding campaign that set about to do its work. Now, it's not a totally happy ending because there was a programming error in one of the smart contracts. And in the end, the creators gave the money back to the funders. But, you know, Bob Dylan, there's something going on here and you don't know what it is. We're talking about the deep structure and architecture of the firm. And I think if Peter Drucker were to be here, and this is always a dangerous thing to do, but he would not say this is necessarily a terrible thing, because Drucker, among other things, was a pragmatist, but he was also very aware of the big contextual changes. A lot of his writing, later writings, were about the information age. And he referred to middle managers, for example, as the boosters of the faint signals that pass for communication in the pre-information organization. So there aren't going to be a bunch of these organizations wiping out all knowledge work in the next decade or so, but this is a little taste of where we're going. And the old social contract that we have, I don't think is going to work. We're going to have to find a way to build a new one. I have no idea how we get from here to there, but I think the contours of what is needed are now starting to shape up.
Okay, and so that leads me to something else, because in our closing minutes, I want to get your perspectives on two distinct topics. So one is education, right? So some of you mentioned education. What type of education and what does it look like do you think is required to help people understand what's coming or how to respond to it? Especially if we're talking about it in the context of a social contract, or we're talking about it as a belief system, or we're talking about as shared philosophies or augmentation. I mean, what do we need to tell people now that's more practical in your minds? If you were sitting in a boardroom with a bunch of leaders of a company, what would you say? Rahaf, can we start with you on that?
I mean, I think the good news here is that when you look at information consumption, what we really see is a set of skills that can be learned and can be developed. You know, we have been taught over the course of, when you look at how people have been taught at schools and at universities, we were taught to consume information in a linear way. We were taught to consume information in a limited ecosystems. We were taught with textbooks. And now that we are entering this age where there is unlimited information, where the ecosystem is just almost infinite, I just think the first step is to prepare students to actually consume information in that space. And I teach MBA students in Paris, and one of the things that we've had to develop in the course curriculum is an information diet. Because if you look at the way that you're consuming information, so many of us are skimming. It's almost like junk food. You're reading, you know, tweets, you're reading 800-word blog posts, you're reading this like stuff that's coming up on your feed. And I asked them, because they have to do a research project, I asked them, you know, how many of you are going to read, we're planning to read a book on this topic, we're planning on reading long form, we're planning on doing a detailed analysis of the different perspectives and understanding, you know, where people's intentions were and what they were publishing. And the fact that very few of them raised their hand, I ended up having to create a grid for them, a checklist to teach them when you are consuming information that you need to be able to kind of tick these boxes and make sure you're consuming a healthy and varied amount of content that has actually been created. And the second thing I'll say from a philosophical perspective, and I think it was the CEO of Microsoft who said this, who said, we're moving away from a know-it-all age to a learn-it-all age. And I think we need to become comfortable with the idea that we're never going to know everything, we're never going to be able to consume everything. So we need to start developing these abilities that enable us to continuously ask questions, be uncomfortable with uncertainty, and within an organization where we have job descriptions and boxes that we want to put people in and 3-year strategic plans, that we need to start planning on a strategic level for that ambiguity. So how can you plan for ambiguity in your job descriptions, in your service offerings, in the way your employees are spending their time? These are the types of changes that need to happen. It's the only way that we can really plan for what cannot be, plan for the unplanned. But the good news, again, is these are things that can be implemented and things that can be learned. We just have to make them a priority.
Don, could I ask you for your view on the education question?
On education?
Yeah, like what do you think we need to be educating people in terms of how they respond to these coming topics and real issues?
Okay, well, this is a big topic, and we're almost out of time, but so I'll say something very simple. The industrial age social contract is you ought to go to school through high school, and that's until you're 16 years old. We have the wealth in societies to enable post-secondary education. And we also have the wealth to enable some new mechanisms for lifelong learning, because let's face it, when you used to graduate, you kept up in your chosen field. You were set for life. Today you're, set for, 15 minutes. And if you took a technical course, half of what you learned in the first year is obsolete by the time you get to the 4th year. So it's not really what you know that's important, I don't think, when you graduate. It's your capability to think critically, to solve problems, to collaborate, to research, to put things in context, your passion for learning, which, as an aside, is a case for an undergraduate liberal arts education. I think the only 20-year-olds who should be studying accounting are people who always dreamed of being an accountant, because you should study something that you have a passion for. But anyway, I digress. So what does that mean from a point of view of a social contract? We have resources now to do some pretty interesting things to equip us more for lifelong learning in a whole new kind of world where our jobs actually may be separate from the way that we make an income. I mean, let's face it, there's lots to do in society. This leisure society thing was always a pipe dream. And as Rahaf and others have made the point, people get satisfaction out of their jobs. But the idea that I go to a job to make money, I think that may change.
Okay.
And sure, it probably means a universal basic income, but I don't think that's the main sort of contractual thing in the New Deal. The main thing is that if you want to work, you should be able to have a job. Now, it may not be funded by traditional ways and market forces. Maybe there's a lot of this will be in a commons, there'll be not-for-profits. We do some things that enable a whole new generation of entrepreneurship and so on. But that everybody should be able to work, and increasingly to do something that gives them a sense of satisfaction. This is possible. We just need to come up with a new deal to do it.
Right. Thank you. Erica and Julia, could I ask you both to spend our last couple minutes responding to that?
Yeah, I'll just make one comment. I believe that the educational system needs to focus less on just helping students consume information, but actually become sense makers of the information. We have so much information now that we're inundated with acquiring knowledge instead of truly sense making what data is useful, what insights are not useful.
Very good. Julia?
So much about our education is about creating in students the capabilities that we are now busy creating in machines. And we have, and we still are kind of stuck with this mindset that in order to be gainfully employed in the era of machine intelligence, that you have to somehow be able to outthink the machines. And that's sort of setting yourself up to compete in a game you cannot win. You know, the education system, I think, should be putting a lot more focus on some of the things that Don was talking about, maybe the learning how to learn skills, learning what your passion is, but also learning a lot of the soft skills about how to work effectively in a team. And I think that, in fact, we see a lot of that evolution going on in schools today. I know group projects are a much bigger part of high school education, elementary school education, than they were when I was young. So I think this is a dawning realization that we need soft skills training at school.
I want to thank you all. This is a fascinating topic, and I appreciate all the feedback. Thank you.